In the last video, we covered 25 choke techniques. Cross-referencing gave us 3 golden formulas for chokes. I believe choke damage is more controllable than joint locks. Given a choice between a choke and a joint lock, I always choose a choke. The main difficulty with chokes is that the neck is guarded by 2 arms. Opponents often block with their arms, preventing a direct choke. So we pivot to targeting the elbow or wrist with joint locks. Mastering arm lock can break neck defense or secure a direct submission win. That brings us to today's topic: upper limb joint locks, mainly elbows and wrists. Scientifically, a joint lock pushes a joint to its critical movement threshold. Exceeding this threshold results in dislocation or joint failure. Dislocation alone doesn't damage bones, ligaments and tendons absorb the devastating force. Physically, tendons have much higher tensile strength, so ligaments snap first under force. So, joint lock efficiency depends on ligament placement, joint limits, equal ligament stretch limits. Many people aren't clear on what ligaments actually are. Ligaments are like layers of thick duct tape wrapped around a joint. They absorb minor lateral shifts, stabilizing the joint during force generation. Like tape, once stretched beyond their limit, ligaments tear, snap, or stretch permanently. That is how joint locks break ligaments. Back to the main topic: elbow locks. The elbow moves in 4 ways: extension, compression, external, internal rotation. That means 4 ligament limits for lock types. Elbow extension is the armbar, extreme compression is the bicep slicer. Flexed elbow with external rotation is the Americana, internal rotation is the Kimura. These 4 principles are key. Most arm locks fall under one of them. Every effective joint lock requires a lever in the fulcrum, the hardest part to master. For an armbar, the lever is the arm section from elbow to hand. The fulcrum is any wedge point between the elbow and torso, blocking rotation or movement. Like in a standard armbar, wedging your leg over the opponent's neck. A solid fulcrum stops movement and rotation, absorbing the extension force. If pressure is lacking, bridge your hips to generate force. To compare with other armbars, we'll call this the classic armbar. Let's look at other variations. The overhook armbar is a simplified version, flaring the arm outward. Control is weaker than a standard armbar, raising the escape rate. In pros matches, they still prefer a standard centered arm armbar when possible. Entering an armbar from spider guard uses force stored by stepping on the bicep. Shoot the leg out like flicking a finger to anchor the fulcrum, but adjust palm angle for pressure. Next, hooking the armpit from outside in with your leg is lasso guard, which already anchors a solid fulcrum. You can execute an outward armbar directly from this position. For the rubber guard armbar, entering rubber guard is the hardest part. Once you reach the step, it's easy to drape the leg over the neck for an overhook armbar. By the way, from rubber guard, I personally prefer the go-go plata if available. Next, the cross-collar armbar launches directly from closed guard. Because it leaves options open to attack left or right, it's highly deceptive. This position is the shoulder crunch, a rare move attacking the shoulder directly. If submission fails, shift hips out, roll half a turn around the arm, and anchor the leg on the neck. This is the Choi bar. These are armbars with universally accepted names. There are also inverted and reverse armbars. There is no consensus on names or mechanics they're named, just for changing direction relative to standard armbars. For example, the Choi bar applies downward pressure, making it a type of inverted armbar. This side control armbar angles differently from a standard armbar, making it an inverted armbar too. Across all armbars, the key commonality is the fulcrum, though it doesn't always have to be the neck. As long as the fulcrum sits behind the elbow and prevents rotation, it works. Like controlling the armpit in a lasso guard armbar, or using your entire body as a fulcrum and mounted armbar, both effectively stop rotation. Let's watch highlights from BJJ stars 15 and 2025 Micah vs. Roberto. Micah catches a loose, opportunistic armbar. It lacks an effective fulcrum. Micah immediately rolls into a Choi bar, trying to trap the neck with his leg. Roberto notices him hunting for the fulcrum and hides his head to protect his neck. Roberto keeps trying to pull his arm out. Micah slips in an Americana attempt to disrupt him, cycling back to the starting position. Micah tries the Choi bar again. This time Roberto fails to dodge with his neck. Micah traps the neck with his leg. Once the fulcrum is locked, the match ends instantly. That covers armbars. The core is a solid fulcrum and lever point that prevents rotation and escape. With a stable fulcrum, you can calmly locate the lever point to finish the fight. Or like Micah, secure the lever point first, then hunt for the fulcrum dynamically amid chaos. This style requires sharp reflexes and fluid transitions to stay one step ahead of the opponent. It might not suit everyone. The classic Kimura uses for arm endpoints as fulcrum S, rotating the upper arm to torque the shoulder. The core rule of a Kimura: control the wrist and the elbow to force internal rotation. Let's expand this Kimura concept to a broader definition. Any method controlling the wrist and elbow with internal rotation qualifies as a general Kimura. Based on this broad definition, Let's invert the grip of the classic Kimura. To distinguish variations, black gloves represent the cross-side hand. In a classic Kimura, the same side hand grips the wrist, and the cross-side hand blocks the elbow. Now, grip the wrist with the cross-side hand and block the elbow with the same side hand. It still creates Kimura pressure. Because of the reverse grip, this is usually called the reverse Kimura. If you like intricate flashy submissions, you've definitely seen the Toriko Plata. Invented by Tariq Hopstock, it replaces one arm grip from a standard Kimura with a leg. To keep it simple, I call it the classic leg Kimura. It usually opens up from closed guard, triangle chokes, or when defensive arms hug during a classic armbar. Next is the Bola Toe Plata, invented by Rafael Freitas, nicknamed Batlata Cockroach, hence the nickname Cockroach Omoplata. Compared to the reverse Kimura, it replaces one hand with a leg, so I call it the reverse leg Kimura. Both Toriko Plata and Bola Toe Plata look cool in work. Whenever the opponent's arm is bent, opportunities usually arise from closed guard, triangle chokes, or defensive arm hugs during an armbar. Next is the Omoplata. Both Toriko Plata and Bola Toe Plata end with the suffix plata. Omoplata means scapula in Portuguese, which is why several Kimura family submissions end in plata. Of course, that doesn't stop me from categorizing all plata techniques under broad Kimura. In my system, I view the omoplata as a turtle Kimura. The prefix mono in monoplata means single, referring to an omoplata finished with one leg. It usually happens during high knee mount, so I categorize it as a mounted Kimura. Here's a piece of trivia: the gogo plata was mentioned earlier as a choke. Gogo means Adam's apple trachea in Portuguese. During an omoplata, pressing the instep into the neck chokes the airway. It emphasizes finishing a choke from the omoplata position, hence the name gogo plata. Those are the common submission techniques in the Kimura family. Unlike Kimura ice that manipulate the forearm for internal shoulder rotation, external rotation creates the Americana. In competition, variations of the Americana are rare. Most are launched from mount or side control by pitting the opponent's arm to the mat. For comparison, well, consider this setup the classic Americana. Finishing this pinned Americana isn't as easy as it looks. Untrained practitioners intuitively position the opponent's shoulder and elbow at 90-degree angles. Then pull on the Americana, which usually ends in failure. Assuming healthy shoulders, let's test this. Align your arm parallel to your torso with shoulder and elbow at 90 degrees. Keeping the palm fixed, rotating the elbow forward still offers decent mobility. Open the shoulder past 90 degrees and elbow mobility actually increases. Set the elbow under 90 degrees in a flared stance, and you'll find elbow mobility increases even more. Congratulations, we just learned how to defend against the Americana. Conversely, opening the elbow beyond 90 degrees reduces elbow mobility. Keep the shoulder angle under 90 degrees, and the elbow joint locks up completely. Using this precise angle lets you easily tap them out with an Americana. The classic Americana is the only submission in its family that demands strict technique and precision. Its biggest flaw is that when the opponent lies flat, rotational space is extremely limited. We have to calculate every single inch of space with ultimate precision. That's precisely why we need the formula acute shoulder angle plus obtuse elbow angle equals completely locked elbow. Conversely, if their arm isn't pinned to the mat, you get infinite rotational space. That lowers the need for extreme precision as long as you control the forearm. Rotating it outward continuously will eventually yield an Americana submission. Speaking of Americana variations, we must mention the mirror lock. Invented by UFC heavyweight champion and BJJ black belt Frank Mir at UFC 48 on June 19, 2014, he grabbed the glove with both hands, pinched the knee with his legs, placed his ankle against the neck, and rotated outward. He delivered a submission attack with an Americana mechanism. Notice how the opponent's shoulder was acute in the elbow octus, making the mirror lock devastatingly effective. Additionally, the monoplata, Toriko Plata, and Bola Toe Plata mentioned earlier can all rotate in reverse, externally rotating the shoulder for an Americana type submission. For mirror locks, monoplata as Toriko Platas, and Bola Toe Plata as rotation space is unrestricted. Arm angles no longer matter, trust that continuing the rotation will twist the joint off. That wraps up the common submissions in the Americana family. From analyzing Americanas and Kimura, we conclude forearm control plus unlimited space equals every ticket for Kimura as in the Americanas. The last elbow angle is the Bicep Slicer. While armbars extend the arm outward, slicers compress the arm to its maximum bend. Let's test this. Wedge your shin deep into the elbow crook and pull the hand inward with your other hand. The pain comes from muscle crushing the peripheral nerves passing through. Most people tap from this pressure if continued. The medial collateral ligament stretches to snapping points. It commonly occurs when an opponent hugs their arms to defend an armbar. Trap their elbow with your arm and torso so it has no room to retract. Then use full body weight to compress the arm past the ligament limit. If it doesn't snap, they tap fast. Just thinking about when arms bend reveals plenty of opportunities for slicers. It's a brutal move, which is why it's usually only legal for brown belts and above. Armbars, Kimuras, and Americanas all require controlling the torso to maintain ligament tension for the tap. Slicers locate both fulcrum and first points entirely on the arm, ignoring the torso completely. Compared to the other 3 joint locks, slicers require fewer technical details and offer high error tolerance. That concludes everything on elbow locks. Now, let's discuss wrist locks. In BJJ terminology, no matter which direction you twist the wrist, as long as it ruins the wrist, it's a wrist lock. Earlier we noted that joint lock submissions work by stretching ligaments to their critical limits. This applies directly to wrist locks. Apply extension, compression, or rotation to tighten wrist ligaments. Wrist locks often fail because wrist joints are both small and extremely mobile. Opponents can easily rotate their wrist to relieve force and escape, something that doesn't happen at the elbow. Attacking the elbow requires using the limb from the elbow to the hand as a leverage bar. Similarly, attacking the wrist requires using the hand past the wrist as the lever to apply rotational pressure. The wrist must be bent to torque and stretch ligaments like a Kimura or Americana. Next, let's see if extension and compression can replicate elbow lock mechanics. In an armbar, full elbow extension leaves the arm straight like a stick. In a bicep slicer, max compression wedges the arm on its own bone and muscle at an acute angle. Extreme wrist flexion inward or extension outward both from acute angles, meaning wrist locks should mimic slicers. Knowing the theory of wrist locks is different from pulling them off. As emphasized, every effective joint lock requires a lever in the fulcrum. The lever for a wrist lock is the short distance from the wrist to the fingers. When the wrist is straight and rigid, it remains far from ligament limits in any direction with no lever control available. No wrist lock works here. The opponent's wrist must be bent first. When does the wrist naturally bend? Like tying arm wrestling, the wrist instinctively curls inward toward the force. Similarly, when resisting arm locks, pushing back forces the wrist to bend naturally. So, when an opponent resists an arm lock, switch targets to their neck with their already bent wrist. Also in guard or mount escapes, pushing with palms naturally bends the wrist. Now that the lever is solved, let's secure a stable fulcrum. For rotational wrist locks, space to rotate and tighten ligaments matters more than the fulcrum itself. For compressive wrist locks without rotation, a fulcrum is crucial if there's room to retract the arm or straighten the wrist. The compressive wrist lock will miss completely. Spotting a wrist lock attempt, opponents will straighten their wrist or retract their arm. You must block both. Use the mat or your body to block their arm's escape path. For example, pin their elbow to the mat when they push to escape side control, or trap their elbow with your thigh in closed guard so they can't pull back. Mastering wrist locks always requires support from elbow attacks. It's rare to find a bench wrist with a trapped elbow. You must create the sweet spot yourself. Finally, a small detail on wrist locks. Mechanically wrist lock variations of Americanas, Kimura, or slicers work bending toward palm or back of the hand. However, a practical issue arises with palm bend wrist locks. The more you compress, the more wrist deformation ruins palm control, causing the lock to slip and fail. Late in matches, warmed-up mobility and sweat-reduced friction make it even harder to succeed. Personally, I have never hit or been tapped by a palm bend wrist lock under those conditions. Bending toward the back of the hand is different. Harder pressure yields tighter control. Finger ligaments naturally curl toward the palm, forming a perfect stopper that tightens control as pressure builds. This explains why palm bend wrist locks are so notoriously difficult to finish. That completes our coverage of upper limb joint locks. Without either a lever or a fulcrum, a joint lock fails. But if an opponent satisfies one condition, stay alert. Don't fear failed submission attempts. Even pros regularly best catching one in a match is all it takes. Never let opponents assume a top dominant position lets them attack aggressively without fear. Here's a piece of trivia on why IBJJF rules mandate this. Top players reaching mount or back control score no points if they haven't cut the opponent's submission grips. My interpretation of the rule's dominant positioning is meant to build up to a submission. So, securing a submission grip from a bad bottom position neutralizes the top player's positional advantage. This logic makes total sense in live combat. Finally, a rare exception in arm locks that doesn't target the elbow or wrist. The shoulder crunch mentioned earlier shares internal shoulder rotation mechanics with the Kimura. The shoulder crunch draws power straight from the fulcrum, acting like a leverless Kimura. Shoulder and hip joints are ball and socket joints, making them the strongest joints in the body. Without massive compression force, tapping an opponent with a shoulder crunch alone is tough. Rather than a tap, this high-effort lock serves as a transition hub in guard play. It prevents top opponents from flattening chest to chest, risking flattened shoulders or omoplata choi bar counters. Pulling shoulders back shifts center of gravity too far, opening sweeps, or alternate guard setups. Roll low and finish power. The shoulder crunch excels at forcing passive top opponents into hard choices. This shows that protecting wrists and elbows doesn't guarantee arm. Safety direct shoulder attacks remain a threat. That concludes today's episode. Upper body submissions consist of neck chokes, elbow locks, and wrist locks. We've categorized choices across these 3 strategies. The next video is the final chapter of our submission system. We'll cover Noji's most hype leg locks, breaking down why leg locks are the most efficient Noji submission technology.